Hugh White, could you just briefly explain the background to the announcement today about the Black Hawk helicopters?
Yes, Laura. Look, I think this is probably one of the easiest decisions that Minister Miles will have in his time as Defence Minister. The present helicopters the Army are using, the Taipan's European helicopter, has proved to be very unsatisfactory, very hard to maintain. The previous government had announced that they were looking at replacing them early, 10 years earlier than planned, with the Black Hawk. The present government's formalised that decision. I think it's the right thing to do. We need reliable helicopters for the Army in whatever role we imagine for them, and the Black Hawk is a proven good system. So I think that's an easy one for them.
Well, of much wider strategic significance is the strategic review, along with the decision about what submarines we will buy under the AUKUS arrangements. Can you first just remind us what this review was set up last year to achieve?
Yes, look, this is a much bigger and more difficult problem. I mean, it's taken Canberra a very long time to wake up to how seriously Australia's strategic circumstances have deteriorated. And the previous government under Scott Morrison acknowledged that Australia was facing the worst strategic circumstances since the 1930s, which I don't think is an exaggeration, but really did very little about it. And the present government called for this Defence Strategic Review in order to establish an approach to rejigging Australia's defence for what's going to be a much more difficult strategic environment over the years ahead. And that's really the guts of the process, which is now underway and which, as you say, will be concluded within a few weeks' time.
So this really covers a period from now until at least the sort of 2030s and 40s, I guess, which is when we're sort of vaguely hoping that we'll have some submarines, or at least one, in the water. How do they fit together?
Well, the relationship between the decision on the nuclear submarines under AUKUS and the Defence Review is a bit awkward, actually, because it does seem to me that the government was pushed into having a rather rushed review. They've really only given Stephen Smith and Angus Houston about 6 months to do what is a huge task of completely reanalysing Australia's defence policy from the ground up, and they've done that because they wanted the results of that review to coincide with the schedule for the announcement of which submarine we're going to buy, which had been imposed on them by the previous government. So I think one of the problems that the government's going to face is that keeping those two things in track has meant that this very important defence review has been pretty badly rushed.
Well, what signals are we getting about the broad directions of the review and what significant changes it will recommend?
Well, look, the big signal we're getting so far is that we might find that this review marks the end of what you might call the love affair with the Army, which really goes back to John Howard and indeed the East Timor operation back in 1999. Because since then, the Army really has been the kind of favourite child amongst the three services and has got a big share of the money. It's pretty clear from what's coming out from the review that that's reversed, that there's going to be a significant cut in the resources being given to Army. For example, a very expensive project for infantry fighting vehicles, which was due to have been announced by now, has been held off, and it looks like it's going to be scaled back. And I think overall the government's now realising that the idea that the best way for Australia to respond to declining strategic circumstances is to go back to what we used to do in the old days and deploy the Army overseas to fight other people's battles on other people's battlefields. That doesn't make any sense anymore. So I think that's the big shift which seems to be being foreshadowed at the moment.
So that means a more certain focus on air and maritime defence capabilities. How are they likely to change, do you think, as a result of this review?
Well, I think that's exactly right. The review is likely to come up with the recognition that Australia seems to keep on needing to discover that we're an island continent in a very maritime part of the world, and that by definition our defence is all about air and maritime defence. I think the big shift is going to be from a focus on air and maritime operations designed to support projecting the Army overseas to a focus which is more on preventing other countries projecting power by sea against us or against our friends and allies. And I think that's going to be, as the reviews unfold, I think that's going to be the real conclusion that they reach. And I think that's the right direction for us to be heading in.
So that means things like more missiles, I presume?
Well, look, yes, I think there'll be a big focus on more missiles. I think there'll be a big focus too on some systems like mines, sea mines, and I hope there'll be a significant focus on making sure that we get submarines as quickly as possible. One of the big problems is that the government's already committed and seems to be sustaining its commitment to some hugely expensive investments in surface ships, which I tend to think are not the right way to go about the kind of strategic tasks that we're going to be facing over the decades ahead.
So when the review was announced, it was heavily driven by the sort of sense that various defence procurement disasters just kept happening. Why is it that we seem to keep making the same mistakes over and over again?
Well, it certainly is the case that one of the things the reviewers set out to address is the fact that we keep on getting our procurement processes wrong. And I think there's some very persistent reasons for that, and one of them is that we don't really work out in advance what it is we want our forces to be able to do, and if you don't have a clear idea of what exactly you're trying to achieve, it's very tempting just to go for the best possible piece of equipment, and to imagine that if we can only get the sort of a gold-plated piece of equipment, then all our problems will go away. And so we end up going for very risky, very innovative, very expensive things which often aren't delivered on time, don't perform properly when they are delivered. And we've seen this kind of pattern repeating again and again. I think in the end, there's only two solutions to this. The first is we've got to have a really clear idea of what we want our armed forces to be able to do, and to really define our kind of strategic and operational priorities much better than we've done in the past. And as our strategic circumstances become more difficult, I think that's something we have to focus on more and more. The other is we really need a better quality of political leadership of the defence organisation. I mean, the last time Australia managed complex capability acquisitions really effectively with things like the Collins-class submarines and the Anzac frigates was back in Kim Beazley's day, which was a long time ago now, but Beazley was, I think, the last Defence Minister who really led the organisation with real expertise and knowledge. And if we don't get that kind of leadership in the Defence organisation, it's going to be hard to make a big difference to the kinds of mistakes we've seen in the past.
Hugh White, as always, thanks so much for talking to us.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks, Laura.